History books tell us that empires fall in battle by the sword of the enemy or by the thunder of gunfire. But the greatest geopolitical assassination of the 19th century was committed not on a battlefield, but in the dimly lit back room of a bank. The Ottoman Empire, the most powerful empire in the Middle East, was laid upon the table not by enemy armies, but by creditors in London and Paris. What destroyed it was neither cannon fire nor military assault. What slowly and surely suffocated it was the brutal mathematical formula of compound interest. This is the story of the first true debt trap in modern history, and it whispers the bitter truth that proves you do not need to invade a nation to possess it, too simply need to hold its mortgage. To understand how this tragedy began, we must focus on the Ottoman Empire, in the mid-19th century, a structure that still appeared outwardly like a colossal titan. It stretched from the Balkans in Europe, across Anatolia, to the holy cities of Mecca and Medina, commanding the crossroads of the world. Yet beneath the veneer of imperial majesty, the foundation was rotting, and the economy was terminally ill. While Britain and France were completing the Industrial Revolution with steam engines, factories, and railways, the Ottoman economy was frozen in an agrarian medieval structure. It was a land of peasants and craftsmen struggling to compete in a world dominated by machines. The Sultan's treasuries suffered chronic cash shortages. The tax collection system was primitive and inefficient. Corrupt local officials stole half the revenue before it ever reached the capital. Sultans traditionally solved cash problems by debasing currency, but these old methods failed in the modern age. The empire urgently needed capital to survive. It needed a modern army to defend against the menacing Russian Empire to the north. Roads and telegraph lines. It needed to look and act like a modern European power. For a long time, the sultans resisted the temptation of Western loans. There was a deep religious aversion to usury, and a political fear of becoming dependent on the Christian powers of Europe. But in 1853, this resistance broke. The Russian Empire's invasion of Ottoman territory triggered the Crimean War. This was a massive conflict that the Ottomans could not financially sustain alone. Terrified of Russian expansion, Britain and France intervened to aid the Turks. They sent armies and fleets, but they also sent bankers. The war cost the Ottoman treasury millions of gold liras it did not possess. Soldiers needed pay, cannons needed casting, and ships needed provisioning. Sultan Abdülmecid was desperate. His advisors told him the only option to save the empire was to break the ancient taboo. He had to take a loan. In 1854, the Ottoman Empire signed its first foreign loan agreement with a syndicate of British and French bankers. Presented as an act of allied solidarity, the move was actually the first shackle of the golden handcuffs. The loan terms were rapacious. Bankers, knowing the Ottoman credit risk, demanded a steep price. For every 100 units of debt the Sultan signed for, he received only 80 units of cash. The difference was kept as commission, yet the empire had to pay interest on the full 100. This was the original sin of Ottoman finance, borrowing at a punishingly high effective interest rate while receiving far less cash than they owed. However, the cash that reached Istanbul provided an immediate miracle. The army was paid, and the crisis was averted. The Russians were eventually defeated, and the Sultan tasted relief and power. He had discovered a magic trick. With a simple signature in London, he could summon fleets of gold to his doorstep. The war ended in 1856, but the borrowing did not. The Sultan and the Ottoman elite had tasted the forbidden fruit of easy credit and became instantly addicted. Looking at the glittering capitals of London and Paris, they felt a profound sense of inferiority. They wanted Istanbul to be a modern European metropolis. They needed to prove they were a civilized power, not the sick man of Europe. They spent the borrowed money not on infrastructure, industry, or education that would generate a return, but on prestige. They funded the ultimate symbol of imperial vanity, the Dolmabahçe Palace. Sultan Abdülmecid decided Topkapi Palace, the home of his ancestors for 400 years, was old-fashioned and too Asian. He demanded a palace to rival Versailles, one that would make Queen Victoria jealous. This massive structure on the Bosphorus, laden with 14 tons of gold leaf and the world's largest crystal chandelier, was breathtakingly beautiful but built entirely with borrowed money. Its cost was equivalent to a quarter of the empire's entire yearly tax revenue. To pay for this, the Sultan returned to the bankers in 1855, 1858, and 1860. The bankers in London and Paris happily lent, making a fortune on commissions and high interest. They assumed the geographical importance of the Ottomans meant Britain and France would never let them fail the concept of moral hazard. By the 1860s, The Ottoman financial situation had devolved into a classic Ponzi scheme. New loans were required simply to pay the interest on the old ones. Debt payments began to consume the entire budget, rising from perhaps 15% of income in 1862 over 50% by 1870. Think of the implications. 50 cents of every lira collected from a fisherman in Greece, or a farmer in Syria, instantly left the country to pay a bondholder in London. There was nothing left for the military, schools, or infrastructure. The state was being hollowed out from within. The government resorted to local financiers, the Galata Bankers, borrowing at suicidal short-term rates of 18%, 20%, or higher, when the treasury ran dry. Sultan Abdülmecid, who succeeded his brother, had a massive ego and a love for military hardware. He didn't just build palaces, he built a navy, ordering massive ironclad warships from British shipyards. The Ottoman Navy was briefly the third largest in the world. On paper, a fleet the empire could not afford to fuel or maintain. The ships sat rusting in the Golden Horn, floating piles of debt. The breaking point arrived in 1873. A financial panic started globally, leading to the Long Depression. European banks stopped lending. Simultaneously, catastrophe struck the Ottoman heartland. A devastating drought hit Anatolia in 1873 and 1874. Crops failed. Animals died, and the peasants, the tax base, faced starvation. Tax collectors found nothing but dust and corpses. The revenue stream collapsed, but the debt payments remained fixed. In the summer of 1875, the Grand Vizier realized the game was over. The treasury was empty, facing the choice of starving its own people or defaulting. The Ottoman government issued the Decree of Ramadan on October 6, 1875. It announced it would cut debt payments in half. In diplomatic terms, this was a moratorium. In the brutal language of finance, it was a default. The Ottoman Empire had gone bankrupt. The reaction in Europe was furious. Millions of middle-class investors saw their savings wiped out overnight. Diplomatic support from Britain and France evaporated. This financial weakness immediately invited aggression. Seeing the Sultan broke and friendless, the Russian Empire declared war in 1877. The Russo-Turkish War of 1877 was a disaster. The unpaid, undersupplied Ottoman army was routed, and the Russians marched to the suburbs of Istanbul. The empire was forced to sign a humiliating peace treaty, ceding vast territories. But the most devastating clause was financial. Russia imposed a massive war indemnity. The Ottoman Empire was now in an impossible position. It owed hundreds of millions of pounds to the British and French bankers it had already defaulted on, plus a massive war debt to the Russian Tsar. The total debt load was now far greater than the entire value of the Ottoman economy. The empire was insolvent, defenseless, and had lost its credit, territory, and dignity. Sultan Abdülmecid II knew he was the ruler of a corpse. However, the British and French had a smarter idea than territorial conquest, which would be messy and expensive. They decided to conquer it financially. They realized that by simply annexing the Ottoman economy, they could extract wealth indefinitely, without the hassle of governing the people. In 1881, the representatives of the European bondholders arrived in Istanbul. They were bankers with briefcases, not generals with swords. They dictated the terms of surrender, demanding not land, but the cash flow. This led to the Decree of Muharrem, in December 1881, the death certificate of Ottoman independence, and the birth certificate of the debt trap. It established the Ottoman Public Debt Administration, OPDA. The OPDA was not a government agency, but a corporation run by a board representing the banks of Britain, France, Germany, Italy, and Austria. The decree handed over the empire's most valuable sources of revenue directly to this foreign corporation. The Sultan agreed that he could no longer be trusted to collect taxes. So the OPDA took control of taxes on silk, salt, fishing, spirits, tobacco, and stamp duties on all legal documents. The OPDA built its own bureaucracy, hiring over 5,000 tax collectors, who answered not to the Sultan, but to the board. They fanned out across the empire, collecting the wealth of the Ottoman people. If a fisherman caught a fish in the Bosphorus, a portion went to a bondholder in London. If a farmer harvested silk, the profit went to a banker in Paris. This was a state within a state. Between 1881 and 1914, the OPDA collected roughly one-third of the Ottoman Empire's total revenue. 1 out of every 3 coins generated by the economy was siphoned off and sent abroad to service the debt. The Ottoman government was left with the scraps, perpetually poor, unable to invest in education, industry, or infrastructure. They were trapped in a cycle of underdevelopment because their surplus capital was being extracted by the debt trap. The Sultan reigned, but the OPDA ruled. The debt trap not only extracted money but also sovereignty, becoming the tool by which European powers manipulated Ottoman foreign policy. This opened the door for a new player, Germany. While Britain and France were content to just squeeze cash, Germany saw a strategic opportunity. Kaiser Wilhelm II embraced the Sultan, proposing the Berlin-Baghdad Railway. This dream of steel would connect Europe's heart to the Persian Gulf, bypassing the British-controlled Suez Canal, offering the Sultan a lifeline. But the treasury was empty, controlled by the OPDA. The Germans said, "Don't worry, we will lend you the money." A new debt cycle began, primarily financed by Deutsche Bank. The contracts were just as predatory as the British ones, including kilometric guarantees that forced the Ottoman government to pay a guaranteed profit for every mile of track, and, crucially, gave German companies the rights to all oil and minerals found within 20 kilometers of the tracks. The Sultan had exchanged the golden handcuffs of the British for the steel chains of the Germans. By 1910, the Ottoman Empire was effectively a German economic colony. German officers trained the army, German engineers ran the trains, and German banks held the new debt. Britain and France watched with fury as their influence slipped away. The sick man's debt was no longer just a financial issue. It was a source of friction pushing Europe toward World War I. By 1914, the Ottoman leadership, desperate to break free, made a fatal calculation. They joined Germany. They believed that if Germany won the war, they could cancel the debts to Britain and France and abolish the OPDA, regaining financial independence. It was an all-or-nothing gamble. On the day they declared war, the Ottoman government marched to the OPD headquarters, expelled the directors, and stopped payments to London and Paris, briefly tasting freedom. But the gamble failed. The war was a catastrophe, and the empire was destroyed. Yet the debts survived. When the Republic of Turkey was founded by Mustafa Kemal Atatürk in 1923, the European powers returned with their ledgers. At the Treaty of Lausanne, the British and French demanded that the new Turkey pay the debts of the dead empire. They argued, "You inherited the land. You inherit the mortgage." Atatürk fought hard, but agreed to pay, knowing Turkey needed to be part of the global economy. The poor, war-devastated republic spent its first 30 years sending millions of dollars abroad to pay for the reckless spending of the sultans from the 1850s. The final payment on the Ottoman debt was made on May 25, 1954. It took exactly 100 years to pay off the mistake. The story of the Ottoman debt trap is the ultimate lesson in the perils of financial dependency. The Ottomans thought they could import modernity and buy the appearance of a great power using borrowed money. They failed to realize that money is never neutral. Every loan is a tether. Every bond is a chain. The British and French did not need to conquer Istanbul with soldiers. They simply waited for the compound interest to do the work. They proved that the most effective way to destroy an empire is not to attack it, but to lend it money it can never repay. The sick man of Europe did not die of old age. He was foreclosed upon. The lesson he left behind is written in the red ink of the ledger book. Sovereignty is not just about flags and borders. Sovereignty is about solvency. If you do not own your debt owns you. This is the History Engine channel. For more context, please share your ideas in the comments section. Don't forget to like the video and subscribe.